with the bitter stench of motor oil still wedged deep beneath my fingernails. My brother Orson slid that damn transfer agreement across the table until it hit my coffee mug. "Just sign it," Orson said, his voice dead even as his fingers tapped the wood. "Let Lorna and me run the fleet. Theron's about to defend his thesis, and you don't want the kid humiliated by a senile old man." Lorna stood by the sink with her arms crossed, keeping her eyes fixed on the grey Spokane rain outside. 25 years of bleeding out on icy highways to keep Vanguard freight afloat, and my reward is a noose handed to me by my own wife and brother. They were holding my son's future hostage, trying to bleed me dry. I slowly picked up the cheap plastic pen, lowering my head like a broken dog. When your own flesh and blood backs you into a corner, does a father just fold, or does he crush the lie? If you were in my boots, what would you do? Drop a comment below, hit subscribe, and let me know. The Wipers on the Peterbilt fought a losing battle against the Spokane rain. It was that bone-deep Pacific Northwest drizzle, the kind that soaked right through your Carhartt jacket and settled permanently in your joints. 3 weeks hauling timber down from the Canadian border. 21 days of sleeping in rest stops, living on black coffee, and wrestling 80,000 pounds of steel through the mud. All to keep Vanguard freight in the black. I pulled my rig into the gravel driveway behind the house. The air brakes hissed, exhaling a long, tired breath that matched my own. The porch light was on, cutting through the fog. But right there, parked at a diagonal angle that ate up most of the concrete, was Orson's Silverado. I killed the engine and sat in the dark cab for a minute. My younger brother was supposed to be running our maintenance shop across town. Lately, he spent more time at my house than I did. I grabbed my canvas duffel and stepped out into the freezing rain. When I pushed the front door open, the smell of roasted garlic and red wine hit me. It smelled like home, but the air inside felt entirely different, heavy, stagnant. I towed off my muddy boots by the mat and walked into the kitchen. Orson was sitting at the head of the dining table. My chair. He had a beer in one hand and a fork in the other, leaning back like he paid the mortgage. Lorna was at the stove, her back to me, wiping down the counter with slow, methodical strokes. "Look who dragged himself out of the mud," Orson said, flashing that easy, careless grin that always made him the favorite mechanic at the shop. "You survived the pass, old man." Ice was thick near the border, but we made the delivery window, I said. My voice was raspy from too much coffee and too little sleep. I looked at my wife. "Smells good, Lorna. Any left?" She didn't turn around. "Plates in the microwave. We ate an hour ago." "I hit a roadblock outside Coeur d'Alene," I said, keeping my tone even. "Thought I called you." "You always hit traffic, Vance," Lorna sighed, tossing the dish towel onto the counter. She finally looked at me, her eyes flat and exhausted. "Orson came over to fix the sump pump. The basement was starting to flood again. Somebody had to deal with it." "Appreciate it," I muttered, opening the microwave to find a lukewarm plate of meatloaf. "Don't sweat it, brother," Orson said, taking a pull from his bottle. "You're out there grinding on the ice. Somebody's got to hold the fort down here." Besides, Lorna was going crazy with the noise the pump was making. Just looking out for the family. I grabbed a fork and leaned against the counter to eat. The food tasted like sawdust, but I forced it down. "How's the fleet holding up?" "Hanging by a thread," Orson said, peeling the wet label off his beer. "Number 3 needs a whole new transmission. Gears are completely stripped." I told Lorna to authorize the purchase order from Ironclad this morning. "You're bleeding money on these old rigs, Vance. You're out there killing yourself while I'm back here trying to keep your rusted junk street legal." "I'll look at the books tomorrow," I said, rubbing the back of my neck. "Has Theron called? I want to see how his thesis prep is going." Lorna crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "Don't bother him. His engineering defense is next Friday. He's stressed out of his mind, and the last thing he needs is you distracting him with trucking stories. Just let the kid breathe. He's got a lot riding on this. Orson chimed in, pointing his bottle at me. Boy's got a real brain. Needs to focus so he doesn't end up with grease permanently stained into his knuckles like us. I gripped my fork a little too hard. Orson was playing the wise uncle, sitting in my chair, giving advice on my son. But I swallowed the bitterness. I was too damn tired to pick a fight. Keeping the peace was how I survived. I'll call him after he passes, I said quietly. I put my half-empty plate in the sink. I'm going down to the basement to put my gear away. Need some quiet. Don't track mud downstairs, Lorna said, turning away to pour herself another glass of wine. And watch your step. You forgot to fix that loose floorboard again. Your memory is getting worse by the day. I didn't forget, I said. I just haven't had the time. Right, she muttered into her glass. Always an excuse. Just like you forgot to sign the insurance renewal last month. If Orson hadn't caught it, the whole fleet would be grounded. I frowned, pausing with my hand on the basement doorknob. I signed those papers in Seattle and mailed them out before I left. They never arrived, Vance, Orson called out from the table. He sounded entirely too patient, like a teacher talking to a slow student. It's fine. I took care of it. But you've been slipping lately. Missing details. Leaving keys in the ignitions. You're burnt out, man. I stared at him. I hadn't left a key in an ignition in 30 years. I opened my mouth to argue, but the sheer exhaustion in my bones weighed me down. They were tag-teaming me, and I simply didn't have the energy to fight two fronts. I'm going downstairs, I said quietly. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight as I descended into the damp, concrete-walled basement. It smelled faintly of old pine, motor oil, and mildew. My workbench sat in the far corner, cluttered with spare engine parts and milk crates full of old tax files. I hoisted the heavy bag onto the edge of the bench. My shoulder clipped a tall stack of cardboard boxes. Lorna had hauled down from the attic last spring. The top box teetered. I reached out with stiff, cold fingers to catch it, but I was a second too late. It hit the concrete floor with a sharp, ugly crash. The sound of breaking glass echoed off the cinder block walls. Damn it, I whispered. I dropped to my knees, brushing aside moth-eaten sweaters and old bank statements. Underneath the mess was the heavy oak picture frame from our 20th anniversary. The glass had completely shattered, a spiderweb of cracks obscuring the photo of Lorna and me standing on the porch. I carefully picked up the wooden frame, trying to shake the loose shards into my palm. The impact had warped the cheap brown backing paper. As I pulled the photo away to salvage it, something slipped out from behind the cardboard. It wasn't another photo. It was a folded piece of yellow legal paper. I frowned, setting the broken frame aside. The paper felt brittle, the edges yellowed with age. I unfolded it under the harsh glare of the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The handwriting hit me before the words did. Sloppy, slanted heavily to the right, aggressive pressure on the downstrokes. I'd seen that scrawl on 1,000 repair orders. It was Orson's handwriting. Lorna, stop panicking. If the kid is mine, that idiot will never know. He's out in Alaska freezing his ass off for the next 2 months anyway. We'll say he was early. He's too busy hugging a steering wheel to do the math. He'll just work like a mule paying the bills, raising our boy. We just have to act normal. Burn this. Oh, the air in the basement vanished. My lungs refused to expand. I stared at the faded blue ink, reading the words over and over until they blurred into a meaningless dark smudge. If the kid is mine. Raising our boy. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, chilling me straight to the bone. My hands started to shake. Not a slight tremor, but a violent, uncontrollable shaking. I dropped the letter onto the workbench and tore open the bottom drawer of my metal filing cabinet. I dug frantically through the old files, tossing folders over my shoulder until I found a dusty, leather-bound book. Logbook, 1999. I ripped through the stiff pages, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. February 1999. There it was. The Prudhoe Bay. Run. Vanguard Freight had been on the verge of bankruptcy. I had taken a desperate, brutal 2-month contract hauling drilling equipment on the ice roads just to keep our house from foreclosure. 2 solid months away from a new wife who claimed she was lonely. Theron was born that October. They told me he was 6 weeks premature. He was a healthy 8 pounds. I had questioned it back then, just for a fraction of a second. But Lorna had cried. She called me paranoid. I wanted to be a father so badly I blinded myself to the truth. 25 years. I looked down at the yellow paper resting on the scarred wood of the bench. 25 years of killing myself on the road, missing birthdays, missing anniversaries, sleeping in freezing truck stops while my brother sat in my chair, while he slept in my bed, while he raised his son on my dime. A deep, primal heat flared in the center of my chest. The nausea hit me so hard I had to grab the edge of the workbench to stay upright. They hadn't just stolen my money. They had stolen my reality. They had weaponized my love for a boy who wasn't even mine. I tasted copper in the back of my mouth. I wanted to march upstairs. I wanted to grab the heavy steel wrench next to the logbook, drag Orson out of my kitchen by his throat, and beat him until my knuckles broke. I wanted to tear the house down to the studs. Then the wooden stairs creaked, heavy boots stepping down, one by one, casual, confident. "Vance?" Orson's voice drifted down the stairwell, echoing off the concrete. "Heard a crash down there. You break something, old man?" I stood frozen in the dim light. The letter was sitting openly on the workbench. My blood pounded in my ears like a blown tire slapping the asphalt. The footsteps got closer. He was halfway down. "Brought you a fresh beer," Orson called out, his shadow stretching across the basement floor. "Thought maybe you could use a hand cleaning up your mess." I looked at the yellow paper. Then I looked at the wrench. One swing and 25 years of lies would be settled on this floor. But if I did that, I'd lose the company. I'd die in prison, and Theron would be left with them. I snatched the brittle letter, folded it tight, and shoved it deep into the front pocket of my jeans just as Orson's boots hit the concrete. He stepped into the light, holding out a cold bottle of Coors, a smug smile plastered across his face. "Everything good in the dark, brother. Everything good in the dark, brother." Orson's voice echoed off the damp cinder block. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, holding out a sweating bottle of Coors. I kept my hand buried deep in my pocket. My fingers curled tight around the folded yellow paper. The heavy steel wrench on my workbench was barely 18 inches away. The part of me that had spent 25 years bleeding on the asphalt for this family wanted to pick it up and end things right there on the concrete. Just one solid swing to shatter his jaw. Instead, I forced the adrenaline down into my gut and let out a slow, ragged breath. "Knocked a box over," I muttered, turning my back to him. I knelt down and started picking up the jagged pieces of the anniversary frame with my bare hands. Just clumsy. Orson walked over, his heavy work boots crunching on a shard of glass. He looked down at me, taking a casual pull from his beer. "You look like hell, Vance. Time to face facts. You can't be hauling 80,000 pounds on the ice when your reflexes are shot." "I'll clean this up," I said quietly. A sharp edge of glass caught my thumb, drawing a thin line of dark blood. I wiped it on my jeans, not feeling a thing. "Leave the beer. I'll be up in a minute." He set the bottle on the workbench, exactly where the letter had been resting a minute ago. "Don't take all night. Lorna's tired. She doesn't need you banging around down here." His footsteps faded up the stairs. The kitchen door clicked shut. I didn't touch the beer. I pulled the letter out of my pocket, flattening the brittle paper against the wood. A handwritten note from 1999 wouldn't hold up in court. A slick lawyer would dismiss it as a fake, or Lorna would just claim it was a sick joke. I needed undeniable, scientific proof. I needed blood and bone facts. I didn't sleep a single minute that night. I lay rigid on the far edge of the mattress, listening to Lorna breathe in the dark. Every time she shifted, the bed springs groaned, and the bile rose hot in my throat. At 4 in the morning, long before the Spokane fog even thought about lifting, I slipped out of bed. I walked quietly down the hall to the guest bathroom. Orson always used it when he was over fixing things. I checked the small trash can and found a cheap black pocket comb. I pulled 3 coarse, dark hairs from the plastic teeth, making sure the roots were intact, and sealed them in a small Ziploc baggie. Next, I went to Theron's old bedroom. He hadn't lived here since he moved into his campus apartment, but his winter clothes were still boxed up in the closet. The room smelled faintly of stale deodorant and old textbooks. I dug through the cedar chest until I found his favorite wool beanie. I plucked 2 light brown hairs woven into the fabric. I put both baggies into a padded envelope addressed to an independent lab in Seattle. 5-day turnaround. I dropped it in a priority drop box on my way to the freight yard. By 6 a.m., I was pulling my pickup into the Vanguard freight lot. The rain had settled into a heavy, freezing mist that clung to the chain-link fence. Number 3. A weathered Freightliner Cascadia was parked over the inspection pit in the main maintenance bay. According to the digital ledger I had checked on Lorna's iPad, Vanguard had just dropped $8,000 on a factory-refurbished air brake assembly for this exact truck. The vendor on the invoice was a company called Ironclad LLC. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and a wire brush from my truck box and climbed down the greasy metal ladder into the concrete pit. The underside of a rig tells a story, if you know how to read it. I angled the beam up at the massive iron brake chambers. They looked clean. A thick layer of fresh, high-temp black rubberized undercoating was sprayed over the casing, but the mounting bolts were unevenly worn, the edges chewed up by an impact wrench that had been set way too high. I reached up with the wire brush and started scrubbing violently at a patch of metal near the rear seal. Orson was a decent mechanic, but he was arrogant. He hadn't bothered to sand the metal before he painted it. The black sludge flaked away easily in the cold air, revealing a thick layer of rust and pitted iron. I kept scrubbing until the stamped serial number emerged from the grime. I wiped the grease off with my thumb, pulled out my phone, and ran the number through a salvage yard database I used for cross-referencing parts. The screen loaded slowly, the little loading circle spinning like a ticking clock. My gut twisted into a tight, cold knot. Manufacture year 2014. Salvaged from a yard down in Boise 3 years ago. Sold for scrap value, $350. $8,000 paid to Ironclad LLC for junkyard brakes that cost a few $100. They weren't just cheating on me in my own bed. They were bleeding my company dry, piece by piece, and pocketing the cash. I drove back to the house just as the pale sun started to break through the overcast sky. Lorna was sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling through her tablet with a mug of coffee. Orson was leaning against the counter across from her, eating a piece of toast. He acted like he owned the place, wearing a clean shirt, completely relaxed in my home. "Where have you been?" Lorna asked, not bothering to look up. "You left the front door unlocked." "Went down to the yard," I said, walking to the sink to wash the black grease off my hands. "Checked out number 3. That brake assembly looks awfully worn for a refurbished unit." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the running faucet splashing against the stainless steel sink. I turned off the water, grabbed a towel, and looked at them. Orson stopped chewing. He exchanged a split-second look with Lorna before turning to me, a tight, patronizing smile forming on his face. "It's a remanufactured casing, Vance," Orson said smoothly. "Internal valves are brand new. It's how Ironclad saves us money on freight. I told you this weeks ago." "I scraped the paint off," I said, keeping my voice dead even. "The serial number traces back to a 2014 scrapyard pull out of Boise. I don't remember authorizing $8,000 for junkyard parts from a company I've never heard of." Lorna slammed her tablet face down on the granite counter. "Are you kidding me right now?" she snapped, her eyes welling up with tears instantly. She always used tears as a weapon. "You're interrogating us over keeping your trucks on the road? I spend half my week fighting off creditors because your routes aren't pulling in enough revenue, and you're accusing us of stealing?" I'm just looking at the books, Lorna. The cash flow is bleeding out. Because the trucks are ancient, Orson yelled, taking a step toward me. He shoved his half-full coffee mug hard across the counter. It tipped off the edge, shattering against the floor and splashing hot brown liquid all over my work boots. I didn't flinch. I just stared at him. Orson stepped right into my personal space, towering over me. He smelled like stale beer and unchecked aggression. You know what your problem is, big brother? Orson hissed, pointing a thick, grease-stained finger an inch from my nose. You're seeing ghosts. You're hallucinating scrap parts because you're losing your mind. You are completely delusional from sleep deprivation. It's my shop, Orson, I said softly, standing my ground. Is it? Orson fired back. Because you've been acting crazy since you got home. Dropping things in the basement, forgetting insurance papers. You make one more mess in this house. You make Lorna cry one more time, and I swear to God, I will call Theron. My jaw locked. The mention of my boy was a physical blow. Don't bring the kid into this. He is in this, Lorna cried out from behind him, wiping away her fake tears. He's terrified. You think he wants a psychotic father ruining his thesis defense next week? I'll call him right now, Orson threatened, pulling his phone from his pocket and tapping the screen against my chest. I'll tell him his old man is having a paranoid breakdown. Don't make a scene, Vance. You want him humiliated in front of his professors because of your delusions? I looked at Lorna. She was staring at me, her eyes completely devoid of empathy. She was letting him use my son as a weapon to shut me up. They were boxing me in, tying my hands with the one thing I couldn't risk losing. If I fought back now, without absolute proof, they would destroy my son's biggest moment and use it to label me insane. Orson was building a narrative, and I was stepping right into it. I looked at the spilled coffee on the floor, swallowing the bile rising in my throat. I had to eat the dirt. My mistake, I whispered, lowering my eyes to play the broken dog. I'm just tired. Yeah, you are, Orson sneered, stepping back and slipping his phone into his pocket. Go get some sleep, old man. Let the adults handle the business. He turned his back to me, perfectly comfortable in his victory. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, staring at the shattered mug on the floor, my hands trembling with suppressed rage. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I slipped my hand in and felt the screen. A text alert. Hey, Dad. Uncle Orson said you're acting paranoid today. Are you okay? Please take it easy. I really need you at my defense. I gripped the phone until my knuckles turned white. They were already laying the groundwork. Then, a second notification buzzed. The lab in Seattle had received the package. 5 days until the DNA results were ready. 5 days. They had the noose perfectly measured around my neck, but they didn't realize I was already building the gallows. I spent the next 2 days eating dirt. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, harder than throwing chains on a rig in a Snoqualmie-Pass blizzard. Every time I walked into the kitchen, I kept my head down. When Lorna snapped at me for tracking mud onto the linoleum, I apologized and grabbed a mop. When Orson made a condescending joke about my memory slipping, I forced a weak, agreeable nod. Playing the broken, exhausted old man took everything I had. But if you want to catch a timber wolf, you don't wave a rifle around. You lay in the snow and bleed. On Wednesday morning, I told Lorna I was deadheading a rig down to Seattle to meet a freight broker. She didn't even look up from her iPad. She just told me not to fall asleep at the wheel and to remember my blood pressure pills. I didn't take a semi. I took my beat-up Ford pickup, pushing it hard west on I-90. Downtown Seattle felt like a different planet. The towering glass skyscrapers and men in tailored suits moving quickly through the rain made me acutely aware of the grease permanently embedded in my knuckles. I parked in a subterranean garage and rode the elevator to the 36th floor. The firm was called Hayes & Sterling. I didn't use company money to retain them. I had cashed out a private IRA I'd been quietly feeding for 20 years. Money I originally earmarked for Theron's first down payment on a house. I sat in a leather chair across from Marcus Sterling, a corporate litigator who looked perfectly comfortable destroying lives for a living. Next to him was a younger guy with a laptop, a forensic accountant. "I need to prove my wife and brother are bleeding my freight company dry," I said, sliding a heavy manila folder across the polished mahogany desk. Copies of purchase orders, bank statements, and maintenance logs I pulled off my wife's tablet. They're routing company funds to a vendor called Ironclad LLC for premium refurbished truck parts. But I checked the rigs. They're installing scrap metal. Sterling didn't offer any fake sympathy. He just opened the folder. "A classic ghost vendor scheme," he said, his voice flat and clinical. "You suspect they own Ironclad LLC. I need you to prove it," I said. The accountant pulled the ledger sheets toward him and started typing rapidly. If they set up an LLC, they needed an employer identification number. Most amateurs use a registered agent to hide their names on the state level, but the money has to land somewhere real. "Can you trace it?" I asked. "Give me 10 minutes, he said, his eyes glued to the screen. The room was silent except for the frantic clicking of the keyboard. I stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the grey Puget Sound, my chest tight. If I was wrong, if I was just a paranoid old man losing his mind, this was the moment I'd find out. "Got it," the accountant said softly. He turned his laptop around so I could see the screen. I ran a skip trace on the routing numbers from the Vanguard wire transfers. Ironclad's Delaware registration is cloaked, but the receiving bank account is right here in Washington. It's a joint commercial account at a credit union in Spokane. He tapped the screen with a pen. The primary signatories are Lorna Vance and Orson Vance. The air left my lungs. Seeing their names printed side by side on a federal document made the betrayal solid. "That crosses the line from a marital dispute to a federal crime," Sterling said, leaning back in his chair. "It's wire fraud. They are using electronic banking across state lines to execute a scheme to defraud a business. The FBI field office would love this. They're looking at 5 to 10 years in federal prison." "No feds," I said immediately. "If the government freezes Vanguard's accounts, my drivers don't get paid. The company goes under. That business is the only legacy I have left for my son." Sterling raised an eyebrow. "So what's the play?" "Leverage," I said, my voice hardening. "I want you to draft a comprehensive forfeiture agreement. They sign over all equity in Vanguard Freight, they waive all claims to marital assets, and they walk away with absolutely nothing. If they don't sign, I hand this evidence to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division." Sterling smiled, a thin, predatory curve of the lips. "A loaded gun to the head. It's risky. If they call your bluff, they could drain the accounts and run." "They won't run," I said. "They think I'm weak. Just draft the paperwork." The drive back through the mountains felt longer than the trip there. The rain turned to sleet, battering the windshield. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was long gone. The house was quiet, but Orson's Silverado was parked by the garage. I walked through the back door and took off my wet boots. The kitchen was warm, smelling faintly of roasted chicken. Lorna was wiping down the counter. Orson was sitting at the island, a thick stack of stapled papers resting on the granite in front of him. "You're late," Lorna said, not turning around. "Broker meeting run long?" "Traffic on the pass," I replied, keeping my eyes downcast. "Didn't secure the contract. They wanted rates we can't afford." "It's fine, Vance," Orson said, his tone dripping with an artificial soothing patience. "We need to talk anyway. Have a seat." I walked over and stood by the island, refusing to sit. "What is this?" Orson spun the paperwork around so it faced me. The bold header read, "Relinquishment of operating authority and medical proxy." My stomach plummeted, but I kept my face blank. "We talked to a lawyer today," Lorna said, turning around and leaning against the sink. She looked at me with those wide, perfectly acted eyes of concern. "You're burning out, Vance. The mistakes you're making at the yard, the memory lapses, it's getting dangerous, for you and for the company. I just need a few good nights of sleep," I muttered, playing the defensive, tired old man. "It's past that," Orson said smoothly, tapping the document. "This agreement just temporarily transfers the executive authority to me. I manage the fleet, Lorna handles the books, and you take a 6-month leave of absence. The medical proxy just allows us to handle things if you deteriorate further." It was a kill shot. If I signed it, I handed them the keys to the castle and the legal right to lock me in a nursing home whenever they saw fit. They were accelerating the timeline. "I can't just sign away the company," I said, letting a tremor of panic bleed into my voice. "I need to read this. I need to have a lawyer look at the phrasing." Orson's sympathetic mask slipped, just a fraction of an inch. His jaw tightened. "It's standard boilerplate, brother. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Theron's engineering defense is Friday. He's already a nervous wreck. If you fight this, if you force us to go to court and get a judge to declare you incompetent, it's going to break the kid's heart. He doesn't need a public spectacle." He was doing it again, tying my hands with my love for the boy. "I need time," I said quietly, taking a step back. "I'll read it tonight." "Friday morning, Vance," Lorna warned, her voice losing its warmth. "We aren't asking." I didn't argue. I turned and walked out of the house, grabbing my jacket off the hook. I needed air. I needed to get away from them before I took a steel wrench and caved his head in. I walked out into the freezing rain and climbed into the dark cab of my pickup. I shut the door, the silence of the insulated cab wrapping around me. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I had the wire fraud-proof, but they were backing me into a corner fast. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. A new notification was sitting on the lock screen. Sender: Pacific Northwest Genetics Lab. Subject: expedited results. My thumb hovered over the screen. This was the final piece, the absolute truth. I tapped the notification and the PDF loaded slowly in the dim light of the cab. I scrolled past the medical terminology, my eyes burning as I searched for the conclusion. My breath fogged the cold glass of the window. At the bottom of the second page, highlighted in a black bordered box, were the words, "Probability of paternity. 0%." I sat there as the rain pounded against the metal roof. 0%. Not a margin of error, just 0. 24 years. Missing birthdays, sleeping in frozen cabs, breaking my back to pay for tuition, loving a boy who shared the blood of the man currently trying to steal my life. The last flicker of warmth inside me, the part that still believed in family, died right there in the dark. The glow from my phone screen felt like a physical weight pressing against my eyes. I sat in the cold cab of my pickup, the Spokane rain drumming a relentless beat against the metal roof. Probability of paternity, 0%. I didn't yell. I didn't smash my fists into the steering wheel. When a steer tire blows out at 70 miles an hour, panic gets you killed. You lock your elbows, hold the wheel straight, and ride the momentum until the rig grinds to a halt. You save the shaking for after you're parked. Right now, I was still on the highway. I took a slow, jagged breath, tasting the stale coffee on my tongue. I forwarded the lab results to Marcus Sterling's encrypted email. My phone buzzed a minute later. "Received," Sterling texted. "This changes the leverage. They didn't just defraud a company. This is 24 years of marital fraud. Forfeiture agreement is finalized. The criminal referral for the IRS and FBI is bound and ready." "Hold the filings," I typed back. "I'm dropping the papers tomorrow night." I turned the key, put the truck in gear, and drove back to the house. I had to eat the dirt for one more day. Thursday morning broke grey and bitterly cold. The tension in the house was thick enough to choke on. Tomorrow was Theron's engineering defense, and Lorna was buzzing around the kitchen with manic energy, acting like the perfect, supportive mother. I spent the late morning in my home office, dropping a stack of old maintenance logs into a cardboard box. I needed to look like a man preparing to step down. The door swung open. Orson walked in without knocking. He had a yellow tape measure in his hand and a relaxed, cocky tilt to his jaw. "What are you doing?" I asked, watching him hook the metal tape against the doorframe and pull it across the width of the room. "Just getting some dimensions," Orson said casually. He let the tape snap back into its plastic housing with a sharp clack. "That old oak desk of yours takes up way too much space. Thinking about bringing in an L-shaped standing desk. Better for the lower back when I'm dispatching." He was measuring my office for new furniture while I was still standing in it. The absolute arrogance of the man was staggering. "Right," I said quietly, taping my box shut. "Standing desk. Don't take it personal, Vance," he said, tapping the tape measure against his palm. "Company's gotta modernize. You've been running this place like it's 1995. Lorna and I have a vision for Vanguard." "I'm sure you do." My hand hovered over the heavy brass paperweight on the edge of the desk. One swing. I could shatter his jaw and end the smugness right there. But I swallowed the bile and picked up the cardboard box instead. I walked past him and headed toward the kitchen. Lorna was sitting at the granite island, her reading glasses perched on her nose. The Vanguard Freight internal accounting portal was open on her iPad. "Need something?" she asked, clearly annoyed by my presence. "Just grabbing my thermos," I said, stopping by the sink. My eyes flicked to her screen. The pending transfer queue was up. She was pushing through one final wire transfer. $14,000, payable to Ironclad LLC. The memo read, "Engine overhaul, rig number 7. Rig number 7 had been sitting on blocks for a month waiting for a back-ordered alternator, not an engine overhaul. She was getting greedy, draining the operating account right before the proxy signing. "Approving the Ironclad payout today?" I asked, keeping my tone mild. Lorna quickly minimized the window, her jaw tightening. The vendor called. They need net 30 terms settled before they ship the new parts. Orson said it was urgent. "Don't worry about it, Vance. We've got it handled." She tapped the screen, entering her authorization pin. "Okay," I muttered. She had just used our home network to authorize a fraudulent wire transfer across state lines. She just handed the FBI the final nail for her own coffin. I pulled my phone from my pocket and quickly pulled the router log, screenshotting the IP stamp of the transaction. I forwarded it to Sterling. "Add 14 grand to the indictment," I texted him. That evening, Theron came over for dinner. He looked pale, with dark circles under his eyes from weeks of cramming. He sat at the dining room table, pushing a piece of roast beef around his plate. "They're going to tear me apart tomorrow, Dad," Theron said, rubbing the back of his neck. "The review board has 3 structural engineers from Boeing. If my load-bearing calculations are off by a fraction, they'll fail me." I looked at him. The slope of his jaw, the dark, thick hair, things I had always convinced myself he got from my mother's side of the family. Now, looking at Orson sitting right next to him, the physical resemblance was a brutal, physical blow to my chest. "You've put in the work," I said, my voice thick. I forced myself to reach out and put a hand on his shoulder. "Just trust the math. Numbers don't lie, kid." "Thanks, Dad," Theron smiled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "I appreciate you taking the time off the road to be here. I know the fleet is struggling." "Your father isn't going back on the road," Lorna chimed in, pouring more wine. She gave Theron a warm, maternal smile. "He's taking a long, well-deserved retirement. Orson and I are going to handle the heavy lifting from now on." Theron looked surprised, glancing between me and my brother. "Really? You're stepping down, Uncle Orson?" "Stepping up, kid." Orson grinned, raising his beer bottle. "Somebody's got to keep the lights on around here. Your dad's earned his rest." They had already planted the narrative. They were actively rewriting my legacy in front of my own son, and I had to sit there and chew my food in silence. After dinner, Theron hugged me by the front door. He smelled like cedar and cheap campus coffee. "See you tomorrow, Dad," he whispered. "I need you in the front row." "I wouldn't miss it," I said. I watched his beat-up sedan pull out of the driveway and disappear down the dark street. I didn't go back inside immediately. The sun had gone down, choked out by a heavy storm front moving in from the mountains. I pulled my collar up against the freezing wind and walked over to my pickup. The heavy manila envelope I had picked up from the post office earlier that day was sitting on the passenger seat. I grabbed it and tucked it inside my heavy canvas jacket to keep it dry. I walked up the wooden steps of the porch. The wind was howling, driving freezing rain against my face, but I barely felt it. I stood in the shadows by the front window, looking into my own kitchen. It was just Lorna and Orson now. Orson had opened a bottle of expensive champagne. He poured 2 crystal flutes and handed one to my wife. She was smiling, her face flushed with excitement as she reached out and rested her hand flat against Orson's chest. He leaned down and kissed her, right there in my kitchen, celebrating their victory early, celebrating the fact that tomorrow they would finally own my company, my house, and my son, while I faded away into a nursing home. The cold seeped through my boots, but the fire in my chest was absolute. 25 years of loyalty, 25 years of bone-deep exhaustion. They thought I was a broken, tired old man who would quietly roll over and die. I looked at the heavy manila envelope in my hand. Inside was the DNA report, the yellowed letter, the forensic audit, and a 20-page forfeiture agreement that would leave them with absolutely nothing. The rain hit the thick paper, but it didn't matter. The ink inside was already dry. I reached out and wrapped my freezing fingers around the cold brass doorknob. My mercy was completely gone. Tomorrow, I was going to burn it all down. The lecture hall at Gonzaga University smelled like floor wax and nervous sweat. I sat in the front row, wearing a charcoal suit that hadn't fit right in 10 years, watching my boy dismantle the panel of Boeing engineers. For 90 minutes, Theron stood at the whiteboard, defending his structural load calculations with a quiet, lethal confidence. When the lead engineer finally stood up, smiled, and extended his hand to make it official, the small room erupted. I clapped until my hands were numb, a heavy, suffocating pride sitting in my chest. 2 rows back, Lorna wiped a perfectly timed tear from her cheek. Beside her, Orson whistled loud, clapping Theron on the shoulder like a proud father. It was a beautiful, picture-perfect moment. It made my blood run ice-cold. By 8 o'clock, we were back at the house in Spokane. The rain was coming down in sheets again, beating a heavy rhythm against the roof. Lorna had set out a massive spread of smoked brisket and potato salad on the mahogany dining table. It was just the 4 of us. Orson uncorked a bottle of expensive champagne. He poured 4 glasses and stood at the head of the table. My table. To the smartest kid in the state, Orson boomed, raising his glass high. Next stop, corporate engineering. We always knew you had the brains, Theron. Not like us grease monkeys. Thanks, Uncle Orson. Theron smiled, exhausted but glowing. Couldn't have done it without Vanguard covering the tuition. Speaking of Vanguard, Orson said smoothly. He lowered his glass and shifted gears into strict business. He reached into his leather briefcase on the floor and pulled out a thick stack of papers. He slid the relinquishment of operating authority across the polished wood right past the brisket, until it rested directly in front of me. He uncapped a heavy silver pen and placed it on top. Theron, since you're officially a grown man now, we wanted to share some family business, Orson said, putting a heavy, sympathetic hand on my shoulder. Your dad's been struggling lately. His memory is slipping. He's stepping down tonight on a medical leave. I'm taking over operations so he can finally get some rest. Right, Vance? Theron frowned, sensing the immediate shift in the room. Dad, are you okay? Are you actually sick? The trap was fully sprung. They were weaponizing the boy's big night, using his love to force my hand, expecting me to quietly roll over to keep the peace. I looked at the silver pen. Then I looked at Orson. The smug, arrogant certainty in his eyes was absolute. I didn't reach for the pen. I reached inside my canvas jacket. I pulled out a thick manila envelope, unclasped the metal tie, and pulled out 3 separate stacks of paper. I laid them flat on the center of the table. I'm not sick, I said quietly. My voice was steady, completely stripped of the exhaustion I'd been faking all week. I'm just done paying for scrap metal. Orson stared at the stacks of paper, his confident smile faltering slightly. What is this, Vance? Don't make a scene in front of the kid. I'm not signing your proxy, I said, leaning back in my chair. I want you to look at the first stack. That's a forensic audit prepared by Hayes and Sterling down in Seattle. It tracks $85,000 of Vanguard operating funds routed to a ghost vendor called Ironclad LLC. Lorna's face went paper white. She dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against her porcelain plate. What? Theron asked, leaning forward. Mom, what is he talking about? The employer identification number traces directly to a joint commercial account at Spokane Credit Union, I continued, keeping my eyes locked on Orson. Under both of your names. Wire fraud is a federal offense. The criminal referral for the FBI and the IRS is already drafted. You're out of your mind, Orson barked, though the color was rapidly draining from his face. He stood up, pointing a shaking finger at me. He's hallucinating again, Theron. I told you he was losing it. These are fake. I scraped the undercoating off the brake chambers on rig number 3, Orson, I said, my voice dropping an octave, cutting through his panic like a frozen blade. 2014 scrapyard pulls out of Boise. You billed my company $8 grand for junk metal. And Lorna, that last transfer for 14 grand. I pulled the IP log off our home router. You authorized it from this kitchen yesterday morning. Theron looked at his mother in absolute horror. Mom, is this true? You've been stealing from Dad's company? No, Lorna cried out, her voice shrill and panicked. She looked frantically at Orson, immediately throwing him to the wolves. I didn't know. Orson set up the LLC. He said he was finding us discounted parts. I just authorized the invoices he gave me. Shut up, Lorna, Orson snapped, his alpha male facade completely shattered. He slammed his hands on the table. You greedy bitch, you initiated every single transfer. You wanted the cash to buy that condo in Coeur d'Alene. You bought the scrap metal, she screamed back. You said we deserved the money because he was never around. I kept this fleet alive, Orson roared, turning back to me, desperately trying to justify his theft. You were out playing truck driver while I turned wrenches. I earned that money. I kept a roof over this family's head. I didn't yell. I didn't interrupt their pathetic backstabbing. I just let them tear each other apart for exactly 30 seconds before I slid the second stack of papers toward Theron. Read it, kid, I said softly. Theron, trembling slightly, picked up the brittle yellowed paper. I found that behind a broken picture frame in the basement, I said. Theron read the sloppy handwriting from 1999. His breath hitched. He read it again, his eyes widening as the sick reality of the words registered. He looked up at me, then slowly turned his head to look at Orson. Is this real? Theron whispered, his voice cracking. Look at the blue paper underneath, I told him. Theron pulled the crisp, white genetic report from the Seattle lab. Probability of paternity, 0%. The silence in the room became absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy pressure that pressed against my eardrums. Theron stared at the paper. He started to shake, his breathing turning ragged. He looked at Lorna, his eyes filled with a revulsion, so deep it made my own chest ache. Theron, baby, please, Lorna wept, reaching across the table for him. It was 25 years ago. I was so lonely. He was always on the road, freezing in Alaska. I needed someone here. Theron gagged. He actually leaned away from the table and dry heaved, utterly sickened by the two people he had trusted his entire life. He wiped his mouth, his face twisted in pure disgust. Don't ever speak to me again, Theron choked out, staring at his mother. Either of you, you make me sick. He turned away from them, tears spilling over his cheeks, and practically collapsed into me. I caught him, wrapping my arms tight around his shaking shoulders. He buried his face in my coat and cried like a little kid. I glared at the two parasites standing in my dining room. I pushed the final stack of papers toward Orson. That is a total forfeiture agreement, I said, my voice dead and hollow. You both sign over your entire equity in Vanguard Freight. You waive all claims to this house, the yard, and my retirement accounts. You walk away tonight with the clothes on your backs and absolutely nothing else." Orson stared at me, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. "And if we don't?" I pulled my phone from my pocket and laid it flat on the table, the screen glowing brightly. My thumb hovered over the send icon. "If you don't sign right now, I hit send," I said. Marcus Sterling files the indictment with the FBI field office. The feds freeze your personal accounts by tomorrow morning. You both go to federal prison for a minimum of 5 years, and Theron watches you get hauled away in handcuffs. You have 60 seconds. Orson stared at the phone. He looked at Lorna, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. The tough mechanic was completely gone. He picked up the silver pen he had set out for me just 10 minutes earlier. His hand shook as he signed his name, pressing so hard the paper tore. He shoved the document toward Lorna, who blindly scrawled her signature through her tears. "Get out of my house," I whispered. They didn't pack bags. They didn't argue. Orson grabbed his keys, and Lorna followed him out the door without looking back. 10 minutes later, their cars pulled out of the driveway, tires spinning on the wet asphalt. I stood in the kitchen with Theron. I had my company. I had my house. I had protected my legacy. But as I looked at the boy, I knew my time here was done. The next morning, I sat in Marcus Sterling's office and established an irrevocable blind trust, transferring 100% of Vanguard Freight's ownership to Theron. He was an engineer now. He had a good head on his shoulders. I drove back to the house one last time. I packed a single canvas duffel bag and threw it into the cab of my rusted Peterbilt. 25 years of marriage reduced to a piece of canvas luggage. Theron stood on the porch as I walked out into the rain. "You don't have to go, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, I do, kid," I smiled, tossing my jacket into the cab. "You run the show now. Keep the fleet in the black." "You're my father," Theron said, stepping down into the mud and hugging me hard. "I don't care what the paper says." "I know," I whispered, patting his back. "I know." I climbed up into the cab and fired up the massive diesel engine. Thunder rolled across the grey Spokane sky. I pulled the air horn, a long, piercing blast that tore right through the fog, and shifted into high gear, heading east toward the highway. The wound in my chest would probably bleed forever, but as I hit the on-ramp for the interstate, looking at the open road ahead, I finally had my freedom back. When you spend your whole life acting as the provider, you convince yourself that endurance is love. You swallow the disrespect, you ignore the red flags, and you bleed yourself dry out on the road, thinking it makes you a good man. But silence isn't a shield, it's a shovel. And if you let them, the people you're trying to protect will use it to dig your grave. Don't wait until you're backed against a wall to demand respect. Stand your ground, secure your assets in silence, and never let anyone use your love as leverage. Thank you for listening to my story. Have you ever been betrayed by the people you trusted most? Let me know your story in the comments below. And if this helped you, please hit that subscribe button to support the channel. Keep your eyes on the road, and stay safe out there. The lecture hall at Gonzaga University smelled like floor wax and nervous sweat. I sat in the front row, wearing a charcoal suit that hadn't fit right in 10 years, watching my boy dismantle the panel of Boeing engineers. For 90 minutes, Theron stood at the whiteboard, defending his structural load calculations with a quiet, lethal confidence.